So for this video I'm using King Cole Cotton Soft Crushed Double Knit Yarn, and this is 100% cotton and it's shade 2437 and it's a purple and white self-striping variegated yarn. So to get started you want to make a slip knot. And then just pull it tight, but not too tight. And then put that onto your needle. Now I'm going to cast on a multiple of 4 stitches onto this needle, and I'm going to cast them all onto here, but I am going to be using double pointed needles, so you could cast on onto all your needles straight away if you wanted. I just find it a little bit easier, slightly less fiddly, just to do it onto one and then transfer them over afterwards, but you can really do this however you like. So you just want to cast on a multiple of 4 stitches using your normal cast on method. So once you've cast on all your stitches, you should have something that looks like this. Alternately, if you did cast on onto all your needles to begin with, you will end up with something that looks like what I will have once I've transferred my stitches across over the needles. So once you've got your stitches on all the needles, you should have something like this. So I've got 12 on this needle, 12 on that one and 8 on this one to give a total of 32. You may need more or less depending on the size of the hand you're making for. So before I get started, I just want to tie a knot here. This may not be classically how you're meant to do it, but it's how I do it, just to keep everything together while I'm knitting so I don't end up with a gap at the beginning. And then once you've done that, you can begin knitting your pattern. So to do the band, I'm going to be doing knit 2, purl 2 for 10 rows. And for the first row it can be a little bit tricky because my stitches are quite tight. You may not be as tight as me, but I do tend to knit quite tight. So to knit the first 2 and then purl 2. And then knit 2. So once you've done the first needle, you should have something looking like that, and then you want to move on to the next one and do the same thing again. So you want to knit 2, purl 2 across this part of the row. So once you've done your first 10 rows, you should have something that looks like this. So now I'm going to work on the part of the pattern that's going to go from the band to there. So how many rows you do here will depend on the size of the hand that you're making for, how long you want it to be before you get to the band, etc. I'm going to be doing about 20 rows, I think it is, for this one, but you can adapt this according to your personal preference and size, etc. So this is going to be a 5-row repeat pattern. So for the first row, I'm going to be doing knitting 2 together. So I'll put my needle through 2 stitches here. And then I want to bring the yarn forward because I want to create a stitch as I knit 2 together. So I'm doing a yarn over, knit 2 together here. This is a bit fiddly for your first one. But as I knit the 2, you should see that I've created a stitch here. So after this one you can just bring your yarn over like a purl stitch and then just knit 2 together. and again I've knit two together but created a stitch at the same time. So I'm going to bring forward and then do the same thing again, and I'm going to be repeating this along the whole of this round. So once you've done that, you should notice that you've got gaps in between your stitches as you've done your first row. And this, as I say, is part of a 5-row repeat pattern. So for your next 4 rows, you're just going to do regular knit stitches. So every round, you're just going to knit every stitch. So once you've done a few rows, you should see the pattern starting to take shape like that. So the section I've done here is from the band up until the beginning of the thumb. So what I want to do now is I want to cast off a few stitches for the thumb gap. So for me, I'm going to cast off 8 stitches, but this might depend on the size that you're making, personal preference, etc. I'm going to cast 8 off on this row. You can add or subtract some depending on your style, preference, etc. So to get started, I'm working on the first row in the 5-row repeat pattern. So for the first one, I'm going to be doing my yarn over and then knit 2 together. So once I've done that, I can knit as normal for my next 2 stitches, and then I'm going to cast off. And I want to do this until I've cast off 8 stitches. So once I've done that, I've cast off my row for my thumb, and I want to put that stitch that's left on there. I've got 2 stitches left, and like I did for the first 2, I want to knit 2 together and create a stitch at the same time. So once I've done that, I should be left with 4 and then my 8 stitches that I've dropped. And then for the rest of the row, I'm going to do what I did before. So I'm just going to be doing yarn over, knit 2 together for the rest of the round. So once you've completed the round, you want to do the same thing that you would have done on the rest of your rows for row 2. So you're going to be doing knit stitches as normal, but with one exception here, that you're going to cast on the same amount of stitches that you dropped there. So for me, obviously that's 8, but if you cast off more or less, you want to just cast back on with the same amount. So once you've done that, it should look like that, and then you can turn your work around and knit the last 2 as normal. So once you've done that and you've created the other half of your thumb space, you can just knit the rest of your rounds as normal and just keep going with the same pattern until you get to the top of your fingers where you want to cast off. So once you've worked the next section up from your thumb hole, you should end up with something that looks like this. So you just continued the pattern that you did for this part to go up here. Now you can cast off here if you want, or you can add a band like I'm going to do. So I'm going to make the band to match this one, but instead of doing 10 rows like I've done there, I'm just going to do 2 rows. So for 2 reasons. One is it gives a little bit of a decorative detail at the end, and another is that it stops it from curling at the top. But you can just cast straight off at this point if you wish. So I'm going to knit 2, and then I'm going to purl 2, and I'm just going to keep doing this all the way around this round and for the next one. So I'm just going to do 2 rounds of this and then go to casting off. So once you've done those 2 rows, you should have something like this at the edge. So next you just want to cast off. So you can use your normal method for casting off here. I'm just going to cast off by doing knit 2, cast off, and then purling 2, just so that it matches the band at the top. So I'm going to knit, and then knit, and then lift this stitch over, if I can grab it. And then bring the yarn forward, and for the next 2 stitches I'm going to purl. So once you've cast off all your stitches, you should be left with 1 stitch. So I'm going to take a crochet hook, insert that into the stitch, and then I'm going to go into the beginning of the row or round, and I'm going to pull that through, and then through again, and then trim off the yarn and pull the tail end through. So once you've done, you should end up with something that looks like this. So the last thing you need to do is turn it inside out and then just weave in your tail ends. So you want to take your yarn needle, thread on your yarn end, and then just hide this at the back of your work. And those are your completed lace knit fingerless gloves.